The prairie night was still, yet the silence around that wooden ranch house seemed heavier than any storm. Inside, the long dinner table creaked under the weight of tension rather than food. A father, a man who had braved the desert winds and faced armed riders without flinching, now sat wordless before the sharpest weapons he had ever known, his own children's scorn. Their voices, once filled with laughter, now carried barbs of shame, striking the silent cowboy with every cutting remark. To them, his silence was weakness, his quiet strength mistaken for emptiness. The flicker of oil lamps cast restless shadows against the cabin's walls, and each shadow seemed to echo their accusations. Years of sacrifice, nights spent under bitter cold skies, days of endless labor, every scar etched into his skin, none of it mattered at that moment. What his children saw was not a protector or a provider, but a man too quiet to defend himself. The silence that once made him a figure of mystery and authority now became, in their eyes, a mark of failure. But then, from the edge of that room, came a voice none expected. Soft yet steady, fragile yet fearless, it belonged not to blood or kin, but to the young native girl who had eaten in silence, observing the cruelty unfold. Her words, carried with a clarity that silenced even the storm of insults, broke through the air like the crack of a rifle shot on the open plains. For the first time that night, the weight of shame shifted, not upon the cowboy, but upon those who had forgotten who he truly was. The room froze, as if time itself had paused to listen. The children, their pride shaken, stared in disbelief at the girl who dared to defend the very man they condemned. There was no arrogance in her tone, no demand for gratitude, only truth spoken with the force of someone who understood honor deeper than words. Her defense revealed what their blinded eyes had missed. The cowboy's silence was not weakness, but the measure of a man whose strength lay in actions, not in boasts. In that single moment, the story of a broken dinner became something far greater, a tale of dignity reclaimed, of loyalty born not from obligation, but from choice. And, as the firelight shimmered on the girl's determined face, the cowboy's silence transformed into a symbol. It was no longer the silence of defeat, but of a strength so profound it needed no explanation. And the audience, drawn into that charged room, now waits to see how this clash of pride, silence, and unexpected courage will unfold. The cowboy's silence had always been a mystery. In the town, whispers followed him like dust trailing a horse's hooves. Some said he had once killed a man in the streets at high noon and never spoke of it again. Others believed he had seen too much blood in the war between settlers and tribes, and had chosen silence as a shield. Whatever the truth, his children never knew it. To them, silence was a prison they could not understand, and on that night, it became the reason for their anger. Around the table, the oldest son pounded his fist, declaring that their father's quiet ways had cost them respect in town. "They laugh at us," he said, his voice sharp. "They see you sit alone, never speaking, never fighting back. What kind of man refuses to defend his name?" His words cut deeper than any blade. The daughters lowered their eyes, ashamed not of the town's gossip, but of their father's refusal to answer it. Every bite of food turned bitter with judgment. The cowboy sat motionless, his weathered hands resting on the table, the lines of his face carved by years of hardship. He could have spoken then, could have silenced them all with the weight of truths they could never carry. Yet he chose restraint, just as he had done his whole life. His silence was not absence, but presence, an echo of the battles he had fought, the lives he had spared, and the storms he had endured without complaint. But to his children, silence was cowardice. It was then that the young native girl, seated humbly at the far end of the table, raised her voice. She had been brought into the family months earlier, saved from a burning camp, when sickness swept through her people. She had known loss, hunger, and the cruelty of judgment far sharper than the children's words. Yet she had also known the cowboy's kindness, the food he shared without demand, the shelter he gave without question. And in her eyes, his silence was not weakness, but reverence for a world too harsh to waste on meaningless words. Her voice carried steady as she spoke. "You do not see the man he is. You see only what others whisper. But I have seen him ride through storms to bring food to strangers. I have seen him stare down rifles without raising his own. His silence is not shame, is strength. The room fell still. For the first time that night, the cowboy's children found themselves confronted not by their father's silence, but by the undeniable truth spoken by someone who owed him nothing yet defended him with everything. The eldest son's anger wavered, though pride burned in his eyes. He wanted to speak, to strike back at the girl's bold defense, but her words had lodged like an arrow too deep to pull out. He remembered the nights their father would disappear into the cold and return with pelts, food, or supplies for families left starving after raids. He remembered how their father never asked for thanks, never claimed credit, and yet he never spoke of it to his children either. That silence now seemed different, heavier, almost sacred. The daughters exchanged uneasy glances. Shame began to stir within them, not for their father, but for themselves. They had mocked his quiet ways, thinking him small, while others in town whispered legends of the silent rider who had saved lives without ever speaking his name. And now this girl, once an outsider, revealed a truth they had ignored. Their father's silence was not emptiness, but dignity. The cowboy did not move, did not speak. His gaze was fixed on the table, as though carved from stone. Yet in that stillness, something shifted. His silence, once mistaken for surrender, now seemed unbreakable strength. The children realized they had mistaken absence for weakness, when in truth it was the mark of a man who had endured more than they could fathom. And though he remained silent, the girl's words gave voice to everything he never said. The oil lamp sputtered, and the flame trembled as if echoing the fragile balance of the room. The children's hearts wrestled with pride, with guilt, with the weight of realization that they had dishonored a man who had given everything for them. The girl, though young, had seen more truth than they had in all their years. And with each word she spoke, the air grew thicker, as though the ranch house itself bore witness to a story unfolding beyond mere bloodlines. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters. Inside, the silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was a silence filled with meaning, with questions unspoken, with the first stirring of change in the hearts of those who had been blind. The cowboy remained wordless, but his story was finally being told, not by his voice, but by the courage of one who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking the truth. The night pressed on, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The eldest son leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his pride wrestling with doubt. He wanted to believe his anger was justified, that his father's silence had cost them respect in town. Yet memories came unbidden, memories of nights when the family had food only because their father had hunted in storms, of mornings when they woke to find supplies stacked quietly by the door, never explained, never praised. He began to wonder if silence had always been his father's way of protecting them from burdens they were too young to carry. The younger daughter's eyes filled with tears she could not contain. She remembered the time she had called her father cold, distant, unreachable. But now, as she glanced at the native girl, she realized perhaps she had only mistaken his depth for distance. Perhaps she had mistaken his strength for absence. Shame pricked her heart as she recalled the cruel words she had spoken earlier at the table. Her father's silence had not been weakness. It had been sacrifice. The native girl's voice softened, yet her words struck harder than any accusation. She told them how she had seen the cowboy ride alone into dangerous territory to rescue the wounded, how he had shared his last piece of bread with her when hunger gnawed at her bones, how he had sat by the fire without a word, keeping watch while others slept. He does not speak because he does not need to, she said. His actions are his words, and they are louder than anything you can imagine. For a moment, the silence in the cabin grew so profound it seemed the earth itself was listening. The children, who had always longed for their father's voice, now began to realize they had heard it all along. Through his deeds, his presence, his quiet strength. The cowboy's silence was not a void. It was a language they had failed to understand. The cowboy's eyes finally lifted, though he still did not speak. His gaze, steady and unwavering, fell upon his children. No words passed his lips, yet his eyes carried a weight that shook them more than any shouted lecture. They saw in him not a broken man, but a pillar, scarred yet unshaken. And though he remained silent, the truth was beginning to thunder in their hearts. Outside, The prairie wind shifted, whistling against the wooden boards of the house like the whisper of spirits long gone. The eldest daughter felt her chest tighten, as though the very land had joined the girl's defense of their father. She looked at her siblings and realized the truth they had refused to see. While they judged him for silence, the town quietly revered him for deeds they could not match. The shame of their words now burned hotter than the flames in the hearth. The eldest son, still clinging to his pride, pushed back against the tide of realization. If all this is true, he said bitterly, why has he never told us? Why keep his own children in the dark while strangers sing his praises? His words hung in the air, but they lacked the sharpness they once carried. They were no longer accusations, but desperate questions. The native girl turned her gaze toward him, calm and unflinching. Because he wanted you to walk on lighter shoulders than his, she replied. Because some truths weigh too heavy for the young to bear. He carried them alone so that you could live free of them. Her words stripped away the last of their defenses, exposing not weakness, but a father's unyielding love hidden in silence. The cowboy lowered his eyes again, the firelight carving deep shadows across his weathered face. He had not planned for this moment. He had never sought it. Yet the truth had found its way to the table without him speaking a single word. And in that silence, his children were left to face not only their misunderstanding, but their ungratefulness. The cabin's atmosphere shifted. The judgment that had filled the room now gave way to reflection. The children no longer looked upon their father as the man who failed to speak, but as the man who had spoken through every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every scar upon his hands. They had mistaken his silence for emptiness, but now they began to see it for what it truly was, the language of a man who gave everything without ever asking for anything in return. The eldest son's pride finally began to fracture. He stared at his father's calloused hands, the same hands that had built the ranch, tamed wild horses, and defended their land against outlaws. Those hands were silent, yes, but they had spoken louder than words through every deed. For the first time, the son realized that respect in town was worth nothing compared to the quiet strength sitting at their table. His anger slowly drained, leaving behind a heavy guilt he struggled to hide. The younger daughter reached across the table, her eyes brimming with tears. She placed her small hand over her father's and felt the roughness of skin weathered by years of sacrifice. She had once wished for a father who spoke sweet words, who praised and comforted her with stories like other fathers did. But now she understood. His silence had never been neglect. It had been endurance, a vow to carry burdens so his children would never have to. That realization broke something inside her, and for the first time, she whispered an apology. The native girl watched the change unfold with quiet strength of her own. She had spoken because she could not bear to see truth buried beneath pride. She knew what it meant to lose family, to have no one to defend your name. And in this house, where she had once been a stranger, she found a duty greater than herself, to remind them of the man who had saved them all. Her courage became the voice the cowboy refused to use, and in doing so, she bridged the silence that had divided them. The cowboy's eyes softened, though no words came. He did not need to thank the girl, nor did he need to scold his children. The silence remained, but its weight had shifted. It no longer felt like emptiness, but like a river carrying meaning too deep for language. His children felt it. They knew, without a word spoken, that their father's silence had always been filled with love. As the fire crackled, the room felt smaller, more intimate. The bitterness that had poisoned the meal was gone, replaced by a fragile thread of reconciliation. The children, though still ashamed, began to see their father in a new light. And though they longed for him to speak, to break the silence with even a single word, they understood now that his silence was itself a story of survival, of sacrifice, of strength unspoken yet undeniable. Outside, the moon climbed higher over the wide-open plains, casting silver light over the ranch. Coyotes howled in the distance, but their cries seemed faint compared to the quiet storm that had settled inside the cabin. The eldest son finally lowered his gaze, his arrogance dissolving into humility. He realized that the town's laughter meant nothing compared to the truth revealed tonight. Their father's silence was not weakness. It was legend disguised in humility. The eldest daughter rose from her seat, her heart aching with guilt. She looked at her father and then at the girl who had defended him. "We judged what we never understood," she said softly, her voice breaking. "We wanted him to speak, but we never listened to what his life was already saying." Her words, though trembling, carried a sincerity that filled the silence with newfound respect. The cowboy remained still, his weathered face illuminated by firelight and shadow. Though he gave no response, his children felt the weight of his gaze. It was neither anger nor disappointment. It was the unshakable presence of a man who had endured far worse than their words. In that silence, they finally heard him. The native girl's courage had changed everything. Her defense had turned shame into reflection, anger into understanding. She had spoken with the honesty of someone who had seen beyond appearances, who understood that words were fragile, but actions were eternal. She had revealed the truth of the cowboy not just to his children, but to himself. For perhaps even he had forgotten the power his silence carried. The cabin grew quiet again, but this time the silence was shared. It was no longer the lonely silence of a man misunderstood, but the united silence of a family beginning to heal. Outside, the wind settled. Inside, the fire's glow softened, and for the first time in many years, the cowboy's silence was no longer a burden. It was a bond. The eldest son felt the burden of his words pressing heavier with each passing moment. He remembered the nights when fear gripped the land, raiders on the horizon, cattle stolen, neighbors begging for help. And always, it was his father who rode into the storm, silent but steadfast, returning with order restored. He had never bragged, never demanded praise. The son now realized that silence was not emptiness, it was honor. A bitter shame rose within him, knowing he had mocked the very man who had shielded them from ruin. The younger son, who had stayed quiet through the conflict, finally found his voice. He spoke hesitantly, as though afraid of breaking the fragile calm that had settled in the room. "I remember," he said, "the night of the fire. Everyone thought the barn was lost, but he went in alone. He came out burned and coughing, but he saved the horses and us. I never thanked him." His words trembled, but they pierced the hearts of his siblings, who now saw their father through a lens they had long ignored. The cowboy sat still, yet his silence was no longer misunderstood. His children began to realize that words would have weakened his story, not strengthened it. What mattered was not what he said, but what he did. Every scar was a sentence, every sacrifice a chapter, and his silence was the cover binding it all together. To understand him, they only needed to look closer. The native girl, her eyes calm and steady, leaned forward. "He never spoke because he knew actions would last longer than words," she said. "The land remembers. The people remember. Even the wind carries his story. You were looking for a voice, but the world has already been listening to him." Her words were simple, but they struck with a weight of truth too powerful to deny. The room grew still once more, but it was not the heavy silence of before. It was reverent, almost sacred. The fire flickered low, its glow washing over the cowboy's face like a quiet halo. His children, once blinded by pride, now sat humbled, listening to the only language their father had ever truly spoken, the silence of sacrifice. The eldest daughter rose again, her voice breaking as she turned toward her siblings. "We wanted him to be like other men, full of words and boasts. But we forgot he is not like other men. He is stronger than words. He is the silence that holds this family together." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her voice held firm. She was no longer ashamed of him. She was ashamed of herself. The eldest son clenched his fists, fighting the sting of regret. He remembered how often he had paraded in town, eager to prove himself, eager to speak loudly where his father would not. Yet none of his words, none of his pride, had ever built what his father had built. He had mistaken noise for strength, and now, sitting at that table, he saw clearly that his father's silence was thunder compared to his own empty boasting. The cowboy's eyes swept over them, his gaze steady, his face unreadable. He had endured bullets, storms, and betrayal, yet nothing weighed heavier than the disappointment of his own children. But now, something flickered in his gaze, a faint spark, not of pride, but of relief. Perhaps they were finally beginning to understand. The native girl bowed her head slightly, her words having served their purpose. She had spoken not for herself, but for the man who had saved her life when she had nothing. And in defending him, she had given his children the gift of sight, to see their father not as a silent figure at the table, but as the unshakable force that had carried them all. Outside, the prairie night stretched on, vast and unending. The stars above gleamed cold and eternal. Yet inside the cabin, something fragile and human stirred. The silence no longer divided them. It united them. It was the silence of understanding, of forgiveness slowly taking root, of a family beginning to hear the voice of a man who never needed words to prove who he was. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like fading stars. The eldest son leaned forward, finally unable to contain the weight inside him. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I was wrong." The words felt heavy, foreign on his tongue, but they were the only ones that could carry the truth. He looked at his father with eyes no longer filled with pride or anger, but with remorse. For the first time, he saw not just a silent man, but the guardian of their lives. The younger daughter wept openly, her tears falling onto the wooden table. She remembered every cold morning when their father saddled his horse before dawn, every long night when he returned without complaint. "You gave everything," she whispered, "and we gave nothing back." Her guilt was a storm she could not silence, but in confessing it, she felt the first breath of relief. The cowboy did not speak. He never would. Yet in the weight of his silence, his children began to sense forgiveness. His eyes softened, though they still carried the shadows of a man who had seen too much. It was not in his nature to scold, nor was it in his nature to comfort with words. But his presence, strong, steady, unbroken, was enough to tell them what they longed to know. He had never stopped loving them. The native girl sat quietly now, her part fulfilled. She had defended him not to earn gratitude, but because truth demanded it. She knew the strength of silence, for her people had long told stories not with endless words, but with symbols, actions, and songs carried by the wind. She had seen in the cowboy the same sacred silence, an understanding that the truest things cannot always be spoken. The cabin's air grew thick with unspoken promises. The children did not need their father's voice anymore. They had found his story in the silence he carried, and in the memories of all he had done for them. What once felt like absence now felt like eternity, something larger than words, something that would outlast them all. Dawn crept over the horizon, spilling pale light across the plains. The ranch house, worn by storms and time, stood steady, just as its master had. The children, still gathered around the table, had not slept, yet their hearts had shifted. They no longer saw their father as the silent man who had failed them, but as the quiet fortress who had always protected them. The eldest son rose slowly, his voice firm though his eyes shone with regret. "We will not shame you again," he said, as if swearing an oath. His siblings nodded, each carrying the same realization, that their father's silence was a legacy, not a curse. In their hearts, they knew they would spend their lives trying to honor it. The cowboy looked at them, his face calm, his silence unbroken. Yet something in his gaze told them he had heard, and that was enough. He had no need for words. His children now understood the language he had always spoken. It was the language of strength without noise, of sacrifice without complaint, of love without demand. The native girl stood, her eyes lifting toward the morning sun. She knew this moment would remain with her forever, etched deeper than any scar. She had seen a family torn apart by pride and brought back together by truth, all without a single word from the man at its center. That was the power of silence, the power to change hearts more deeply than any speech ever could. And so, as the sun climbed higher, the silent cowboy sat with his children, bound not by words, but by the unshakable strength of his life. His silence was no longer misunderstood. It was honored. It was feared. It was cherished. It was the voice of the Old West itself, harsh, enduring, eternal. The story of the silent cowboy is more than a tale of one man and his family. It is a mirror reflecting the truth of the Old West itself. In a land where storms, bullets, and betrayal tested the soul, strength was not always shouted. Sometimes it was carried in silence, in scars, and sacrifices too deep for words. His children, blinded by pride, could not see it at first. But when the truth was spoken by the most unlikely voice, they finally understood. Silence can be louder than any cry. This lesson stretches far beyond the walls of that wooden cabin. How often do we mistake quiet endurance for weakness? How often do we demand words when actions have already spoken 1,000 times louder? The cowboy reminds us that dignity does not always ride with noise and fury. It often rides silently, leaving behind trails of deeds that speak for generations. In the stillness of his gaze, his family found the truth. Love does not need to be announced to be real, and sacrifice does not need to be declared to be eternal. His silence, once seen as emptiness, became a legacy of strength, binding his children closer than any speech could. And in that moment, the story of one father became a lesson for every heart that listens. As you reflect on this story, let it linger. Ask yourself, how many silent cowboys stand in your life? People whose strength is overlooked because it does not roar, but whispers. Perhaps their silence is not absence, but proof of love too profound to be captured in words. The answer may change how you see them forever. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journey into the untold legends of the West. And if you felt the weight of the cowboy's silence echo in your heart, leave a like to let his story ride further, reaching others who may need to hear it. Together, we keep these voices, spoken and unspoken, alive.